Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the special live event. May I introduce to you the President of Jewish Broadcasting Service and your host for this evening, Rabbi Mark S. Gurock.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, how lovely. Lovely to see all of you. Thank you for coming here to the Center for Jewish History. And all of you who are watching all over America, thank you for being here, welcoming everyone. And it is just wonderful to be coming to you live. I'm Mark Gurock, and we're thrilled to be coming to you this Monday night live on JBS from the Center for Jewish History on West 15th Street here in New York City for an evening of fascinating discussion of what American Jewish life might have been like if there'd never been a Holocaust during World War II. As we'll be meeting in one moment with one of American Jewry's most gifted historians and writers and observers of Jewish life, Dr. Jeffrey S. Gurock, professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University, who's just written a compelling new book, The Holocaust Averted, an alternative history of American Jewry from 1938 to 1967. And Jeff will be out joining me on stage in just one moment. I first want to take this opportunity to thank our gracious hosts for tonight's special JBS program, the wonderful staff here at the Center for Jewish History, and most specifically, its classy and lovely President and CEO, Jay Levy. And I don't know if Jay is here or not, but he has been wonderful to us in many, many ways. And tonight is really a collaboration, a collaborative effort with a number of other premier institutions of American Jewish life today. The American Jewish Historical Society, the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Yeshiva University, and Rutgers University Press that published The Holocaust Averted. And then, of course, Yeshiva University itself. And we want to especially thank the director of the YU Museum, Jacob Weiss, who did so much to make tonight happen. And you already met Jacob tonight. And Jacob, thank you so much for all you did to make this possible. I also want to acknowledge a very dear friend who's in the audience tonight, an extraordinary presence on the world Jewish scene, Rabbi Avi Weiss. I know, as with me, so many of you have been touched by Avi in so many, many ways, and I consider him to be the individual who has taught all of us what it means to be a responsible Jew. In the latter half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century, the work you do continues to be outstanding. We are in your debt. Kol hakavod to you. Avi Weiss. For years serving the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale and also the Dean of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. So tonight is all about a series of what-ifs. What if? What if Western Europe had stood up to Hitler and the Nazi attempt at world domination and that it never had taken root? What if there'd never been a Holocaust? A thought which, by the way, one must think of with enormous humility and profound respect for the horrific reality that the Shoah did inflict on our people, not only taking the lives of 6 million Jewish men and women and 1.5 million children, but also wiping off the face of the earth the treasure of European Jewry. And so the question is asked with humility: what would Jewish life have looked like? How would Jewish life have evolved over the past 70 years if European Jewry had never been systematically and brutally murdered? What would it mean for the development of American Jewry and for the state of Israel, and for the relationship between American Jews and the Jewish state. And most important of all, what do we learn about ourselves today, about who and what we are as American Jews in the first part of the 21st century, when we consider how Jewish life has in fact evolved because of the Holocaust? These are the questions addressed in this brand new, wonderful book, a wonderful read entitled The Holocaust Averted, an Alternative History of American Jewry from 1938 to 1967. It's been written by one of American Jewry's leading historians, Dr. Jeffrey Gurock, the Libby M. Clapperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University, one of the most brilliant academic minds teaching today. You should also know that Jeff Gurock served for 20 years as the associate editor of the Journal of American Jewish History. Jeff has authored and edited more than 15 books, beginning with his study of When Harlem Was Jewish, which he's now in the process of revising. His book on the impact of Mordechai M. Kaplan on Orthodox Judaism and on American Judaism as a whole, entitled A Modern Heretic and a Traditional Community, earned Dr. Gurock the Saul Wiener Prize for the American Jewish Historical Society's Best Book of the Year in the field of American Jewish history. He's also written a superb overview of Orthodox Jewry in America, which was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. And his study of the Jews in Gotham, New York Jews, in a changing city from 1920 to 2010 was also recognized as the best nonfiction Jewish book of 2012 by the Jewish Book Council. And Jeff has written on Judaism's encounter with American sports. And one of my favorite JBS programs was one we taped right here on this stage at the Center for Jewish History when Jeff sat with Alan Dershowitz to reflect upon the Jewish influence on the game of American basketball. And finally, I am very proud to say that Jeff has been a dear friend and kind enough to appear many, many times on L'chaim, and is one of the JBS audience's favorite guests. And I'm hoping some of you have been aware of L'chaim for a long time. We are now celebrating L'chaim's double Chai anniversary year. Thank you. Thank you. We began 36 years ago on the first Sunday in February of 1979. We have never missed a Sunday from then. And on the very first edition of L'chaim, which premiered on WMCA radio, the show featured remarks by Elie Wiesel. In an interview I had the privilege of doing with the great Yiddish author Isaac Bashevis Singer. And highlights of the final moments of the Yeshiva High School basketball tournament from Madison Square Garden, with Spencer Ross doing the play-by-play and the color commentary being done by Dr. Jeffrey Gurock. 36 years ago, Jeffrey, in addition to starting out on a successful journey as a leading Jewish historian, was also the basketball coach at the Frisch Day School in New Jersey. And whether it's at Madison Square Garden or here at the Center for Jewish History, no one is more thoughtful and insightful and an entertaining voice on the American Jewish scene than is our very special guest tonight. Please join me in giving a warm and gracious welcome to Dr. Jeffrey S. Gurock.
Thank you. Now, let's get to work. Okay.
First of all, you want to put an earpiece in my ear? Give us 1 second. We'll do one piece of housekeeping. Where's Ron Jacobson? Ron, raise your hand. Lovely job by Ron Jacobson. Thank you. Okay. First of all, Yasha Koch Mazal Tov. Fabulous book.
Thank you very much.
Fabulous book. And I've said this to you before. Jeff and I have had the opportunity to talk about many of the books he's written on L'chaim, etc. But I've told you this before. It is so true here. It's a wonderful read. Historians sometimes write books that are very hard to read. Jeff writes as if he's writing to you personally. And there is such an obvious first question. By the way, great cover. You love the cover?
Very striking, very evocative.
Can you see it?
You see railroad tracks, which is evocative of the tragedy of the Shoah, and the tracks veer off to the right, which suggests that it didn't happen.
What if? Very good.
Rutgers did a great job.
Good for Rutgers. Okay. It deserves a round of applause. There is a question that, on the one hand, begs for an answer. At the same time, I told you off camera that you do something else that is often unique. You anticipate your readers' questions. There's an obvious question. Well, how in the world does this book come to be? And Jeff has written a fabulous prologue to the book. And I don't care how much else you read, you've got to make sure you pick up this book. It should be part of your home library, and read the prologue. There's so much beauty in it. And you begin by telling the story that involves you and your wife on a trip to Poland, and how the idea came to you for writing the book. I just want you to take a moment and start there. How did you end up writing the book?
Well, you were very kind to mention my various books, and as I thought about the books I've written, it dawned upon me that in every instance, there's both a personal and professional dimension that go hand in hand. So I wrote a book about Harlem, because my father grew up on Park Avenue, 100th Street and Park Avenue in a tenement. I wrote about sports because I'm a legend in my own mind as an athlete. I wrote about orthodoxy because that's part of the community that I'm very proud to be a member of. I wrote about Jews in New York because, as you hear already, I have this distinctive East Bronx dialect. It's not an accent. So in each instance, I'm writing about things that were very close to me, but I'm trained as a professional historian, and in each instance, I take this personal interest, whether it's family or sports or orthodoxy, and I try to raise it to a level of interest for scholars, and thank you for saying for lay audiences as well. So in this particular instance, 6 or 7 years ago, Pamela and I went on what I've called an adult march of the living to Poland, to Ukraine and Poland. I was personally embarrassed that I had taught the history of the Shoah at yeshiva for a generation, and I'd never seen anything. I'd never been to Eastern Europe. So we went for 2 weeks on a van throughout Eastern Europe. We spent one Shabbat in Krakow, and we davened in the shul there. It was very moving to be davening with a couple of survivors, a gentleman who left Poland in 1938. He came back for the first time with his son, etc. Around the shul, the Poles have constructed a faux, F-A-U-X, Jewish quarter with bookstores, restaurants that aren't kosher, and it gives you a sense of what Jewish life might have been like before the war. In fact, Schindler used that quarter
Steven Spielberg.
Right, for his book his movie on Schindler. Thank you. And then Pam and I were saying to ourselves, there's only one thing missing from this picture. Where are the Jews? Then we came back to New York, and I came across an article in the travel section, and there was an article about the revival of Jewish life in Poland without Jews. So we started to cogitate and think about, well, had there been no Shoah, would we be visiting Eastern Europe. And I imagine Yeshiva University students and Stern College students, almost all of them spend a gap year in Israel. Or maybe they'd be going to Lithuania for a year, a gap year. Affluent Jews who came to America might own villas in Lodz, a great Jewish city. And the thoughts went on and on about what might have been like. After all, it's only 8.5 hours by plane from New York to Krakow. And we also know as history that in the interwar period, both Jews on the left and Orthodox Jews did go back to Poland to visit the communities, to connect, etc. And then the question came to me, would Jews have, American Jews, would they have wanted to go back to Eastern Europe after 100 years of assimilation in this country? So that was my initial thought based upon this. And then I became aware of something that I knew about previously, that there is this thing called counterfactual history. About 50 years ago, a book was done called If the South Had Won the Civil War. Maybe some people had read it. And then I started working on this book, and I came across the fact, an article written by a military historian who said that if the British and French had stood up to Hitler at Munich, the war would have started a year earlier. The Nazis weren't totally ready for invasion, and there's one line in this article where he says there would have been no invasion of Eastern Europe because there would have been no agreement between von Ribbentrop and Molotov, and no Holocaust. So I started thinking, well, maybe I can write about this subject. So I'm a scholar, I'm an academician, and I don't want to be out on left field all by myself. As I start working on the book, I find out I'm not the only person doing this sort of thing. My professional association, called the Association for Jewish Studies, has a panel, and I'm listening to colleagues of mine doing similar types of things for other periods of Jewish history. In fact, I think in the audience, the guru of this dimension, Professor Gabriel Rosenfeld, has put together a whole series of essays on different aspects of Jewish history. What if? What if Baruch Spinoza had become a Baal Tshuva? Interesting. What if the Second Temple was not destroyed? What if there was no Pale of Settlement? So, with that sort of confidence that what I'm doing is both interesting to me and also within the parameters of my discipline, I start working on this book. And it was a great joy, a great challenge. I'll tell you one of the challenges, and then we'll talk about other things. I bet when you were growing up, certainly true of my life, when I was growing up, my parents always said to me, whatever you say, tell the truth. So my kids always chide me. They say, Pop, you've got 5 stories. You tell the same stories over and over again, but in each case, it's always the same story. So I have the sports book. I've given the same speech 58 times. I always tell the same truth. In this book, I'm not telling the truth. I'm making up scenarios. So if you were in my study with me on an ongoing basis, you'd see big charts to remind me that it didn't happen that way. And there are rules to this game of counterfactualism. For example, you can't have Wendell Willkie running for president in 1944 if he dies in 1943. He's out of the game, okay? Going back in history, you can't provide the Jews of Masada with machine guns unless you give the Romans machine guns, okay? There are certain things you cannot do. So based upon this, my interest, my desire to explore this, and knowing that what I'm doing is within the canons of the Academy, I set out to write this book.
Fabulous. I'm thinking to myself, you made choices. You basically have created your own timeline, your own sequence of events. It's fascinating, by the way, to read simply whom Jeff makes President of the United States, when and in which sequence. And for example, one of the first things that happens is Franklin Roosevelt does not run for a third term. And there's a question, you may be thinking to yourself, I wonder whom Jeff makes President of the United States, and how many of the men who did become president are president in his book. Some are, and some people who never became president are. But these are things that you're working on out of your own mind.
Not totally.
I want you to explain to us, how do you craft that I use the word timeline. It's bigger than a timeline. It's an evolution of your alternative history. How do you do it, and does it ever cause anxiety for you as to whether you should go in one direction or the other? If I had been in your study, were there ever moments that either on your own or you talked to a colleague or you talked to Pam, were you having a dilemma about which path your history should take?
I have anxiety daily, okay? One of the great short story writers of the 20th century, Catherine M. Parker, once said that I hate writing, I love having written. So there's always anxiety involved in doing this sort of thing. But the choices I've made were not only part of my own imagination, they're predicated upon real historical facts, but twisted in a certain way.
Give us an example.
So, example, I was unaware of the fact, because I do not read Japanese, that there were great debates within the Japanese war rooms before December 7th, 1941, and you might be surprised to hear that Tojo almost gets outvoted, and they almost do not bomb Pearl Harbor. So I have a line there, on December 7th, 1941, American sailors are sunning themselves in Hawaii. It's very striking.
On the Arizona.
On the Arizona. Second piece, on the question of Roosevelt's third term, there is an enormous amount of literature about his desire to become the only president to serve 3 or 4 terms, and the opposition to him within his party and outside his party. The one thing that makes him run, or makes it possible for him to run, is that the war is coming to America, and there is a great sign when he's reelected, safe on third. He's elected for the 3rd time. Did you know that one of the leading candidates, I can't make up this name, it's a real name, was a Democratic candidate named Paul McNutt of Indiana, a real person who was considered a viable presidential timber. We also know, and this is sort of hilarious, that when Roosevelt decides he's going to run for a 3rd term, again, this is real history, real history. He calls in each of his cabinet members, he tells them, listen, I decided not to run, you will succeed me, where he has every intention of running for a 3rd term. That's how he kept his cabinet in order. In any event, Roosevelt does not run for a 3rd term.
In your book.
In my 3rd term. And if you buy the book, you'll find out who was elected president. But in all seriousness, Robert Taft, an isolationist, becomes the president of the United States in 1940. And America is safe while the world is ablaze. So you have these sorts of things going on. One other thing. I use real primary sources, but with a twist. For example, when Neville Chamberlain comes back from the real Munich in 1938, Winston Churchill delivers a speech. He excoriates Chamberlain, and he says, what you have done has changed the course of human history. So I quote it verbatim. The only twist is, when he finishes, I have the two of them hugging in the well of the House of Commons because he has stood up to Hitler, and now Churchill and Chamberlain are on the same side. So there's abundant primary source material that I used and secondary source material. And there's one other piece that I should say.
But I want to ask a question.
Sure. It
may be the piece you're going to.
Okay.
And I found it so fascinating, I want to make sure I set it up for you.
Okay.
In Jeff's book, America never enters World War II. There's never a Pearl Harbor. But there is a war in Europe.
And in Asia.
And in Asia. And in the end, the Nazis are defeated much more easily, and there is never a Shoah as a result. But the question that Jeff addresses in this counter-history is, to what extent was it viable for there to be Jewish life in Nazi Germany? Not the Holocaust, but in Nazi Germany. And you quote 2 of the most esteemed, eminent Jewish historians of the time, Jacob Marcus and Salo Baron. And I did not know what they said. I want you to tell our audience what was so intriguing to you about their message, and what's the impact?
Well, the funny thing is that when I submitted my book proposal to Marley Wasserman from Rutgers University Press, the lead is, I quote, Barone and Marcus. 1934, Marcus writes a book called The Rise and Destiny of German Jewry, in which he says, notwithstanding the difficult times Jews are facing at this point in Germany, Jews will survive Hitler and the community will flourish. This is 1934. 1937, like 9 months before Kristallnacht, which in my book doesn't happen until 1942, but the real Kristallnacht, the greatest historian of the 20th century, C.O.W. Barone, who you probably know, was the lead witness at the Eichmann trial, portraying the nature of what was lost before they got down to the actual atrocities committed by Eichmann. He writes a similar thing, 1937. He says, German Jewry will survive its difficult times, but we'll get through it, okay? The reality is that there are 500,000 Jews in Germany in 1933. 2/3 of them get out. Now, some of them are fortunate enough to get to America, notwithstanding the immigration laws. Many of them go to Palestine until the British close off Palestine to Jewish migration. And then you have tens of thousands of Jews who go to France and Belgium and Holland, where they're safe for a while, but later on they're captured in the Nazi net. So in real history, most of the German Jews get out. In my story, even more German Jews get out. The only people who stay, and they're under great pressure from the SS. But the SS has its own problems. The SS in 1938 and 1939, in my story, is more concerned with the backbiters who they see as undermining the Nazi regime. So there are Jews in Germany. They have a very difficult time. But, and there's one line I use in 1942 where I have Adolf Eichmann talking to Heinrich Himmler, saying that I only wish there were 6 million Jews under our feet so we can exterminate them. But all we have left in Germany are people who are hanging on, old people, and the like. So it was very striking that Barone and Marcus, they wrote in very diffident fashion, said, and they were wrong. But my book is, what if they were right?
Yes.
And it's very, and by the way, throughout the book, Marcus and Barone, almost Zelig-like, appear in the book.
Yes.
Okay? At one point in the early 1960s, there's a meeting of the Association for Jewish Studies, which has very few members because there are very few Jews in academia, and Barone and Marcus are a little embarrassed when people mention that book. Okay? In real life, I think Marcus was very embarrassed by that book. And, you know, we're under the auspices of the American Jewish Historical Society. One of the reasons that Marcus began studying American Jewish history seriously is because he recognized, as we get to the 1940s, that the mantle of leadership has now fallen upon two centers, Palestine, now Israel, and America. So we had better study our history very carefully. And that is one of the true historical aspects. But yes, indeed, they do say that the Holocaust is not going to take place. Very striking.
All right. Speak to the fact that in your book, Stalin never makes a pact with Hitler. This has all kinds of ramifications in terms of the war. It also has ramifications on the Jews of Eastern Europe. And sort of explain to the audience how in your book does World War II, which again does exist, but it never leads to a Holocaust, how does it come to an end? And where are the Jews in your book at the war's end?
Okay, so there are more than 6 million, 8 million Jews who are under Soviet domination. And we'll talk about the Soviet Jewry movement.
Yes.
I'm so pleased Rabbi Weiss is here because it impacts upon part of his own personal story. And by the way, he's about to publish his memoir of his activities as an activist, which is very exciting as well.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't only plug myself, I plug my friends. In any event, okay, when the war starts in 1938 in Czechoslovakia, the Czechs are good fighters. the Nazis win, but there's a recognition that, the Wehrmacht is not nearly as powerful as we thought they were. At that point, a second Great War, remember World War I only becomes World War I when there's a World War II, is known as the Great War. We're commemorating it now this year and beyond that, okay? The Nazis get bogged down for 6 years in what I call a distant replay, like an instant replay, got to get that sports stuff in somehow, a distant replay of World War I until Hitler is assassinated in 1944.
In your book.
In my book, by the Valkyrie people. Now, you know, in real history, it was very close. In my book, he is assassinated by a fellow whose nickname was Bushy. And there's a monument to Bushy in Berlin. Not really, but in my book there is. All right, so this war is going on. Stalin invades Poland. He had it in for the Poles since the 1920s. He occupies Poland, and 8 million Jews fall under Soviet domination. They are not physically attacked, but they suffer the trauma of being under communist domination throughout that time period. So those are the Jews of Eastern Europe. Palestine, remember, the British have now shown that they are strong. They're standing up to Hitler. And they realize that the threat of the Arabs to be colleagues with the Nazis is not nearly as powerful as they thought previously. So, starting with real history, I look at the writings of Winston Churchill for his plan for Palestine, a pro-Zionist plan, and guess what? The doors of Palestine are open. So Jewish migration continues to Palestine through the 30s and the 40s. Throughout the book, through much of the book, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem shows up, okay? And he's running around Berlin trying to get interviews, trying to promote his side of the story. But the Nazis agree with him ideologically, but they have other issues to deal with, namely their own internal dynamic. So listen to this, 1944, it's Hitler's birthday, okay? They're about to, the children of Joseph Goebbels are about to sing in German, happy birthday to their beloved Uncle Adolf, okay? And then the bomb goes off. The bomb goes off that Bushy has hidden in his pants. Hitler is killed along with many of the Nazi officials. While this is all going on, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem is in Berlin, but he's not invited to the party because he's a Semite. And although they have something in common with the Nazis, they both hate the Jews and hate the British, he's not invited. He sinks to his knees and he thanks Allah for the fact that he's been saved, he's not been killed. He then rushes off to Vienna. As people are rushing towards Berlin, he's rushing to Vienna, and he meets up with a group of black coats. They're not Hasidic Jews, they're Soviet agents who take him to Moscow, okay, where he pitches for Soviet help. And the Meister goes on and on and on. So a lot of these historical figures are used, but it's turned around in a variety of different ways. And while this is all going on, there's a war in the Pacific, okay? We're not involved in it, but the British, the French, and the Dutch are fighting the Japanese into 1946, which is that's very important for another dimension of this book.
Explain.
Well, the European war is over. One of the things that intimidates Stalin is the fact that through back channels, we make it known that we have people working on a bomb that we're going to use if the Soviets invade Western Europe. So
that's in your book.
That holds off.
Because obviously there's no Hiroshima, there's no Nagasaki.
That's correct. That's correct.
Is there a Manhattan Project?
They're very much so. In fact, this gray-haired, disheveled scientist is waiting in the anteroom, and he's called in by President Taft, who starts moving away from isolationism to interventionism because, apart from being an isolationist, he's also strongly anti-communist. There's a great deal of anti-communist...
and that was true.
And that was true. Now, one of the minor players is Julius Rosenberg, who ends up giving secrets to the Soviets which are planted by the FBI with Herbert Hoover in order for the Soviets to think we have the bomb. And when Einstein meets with the president, the only thing, the president has no idea what he's talking about. But he says, can you hurry up, get this thing going? So the war in Europe ends. 1946, the British are bogged down in fighting the Japanese. At that point, the Zionists in Palestine and the Arab nationalists in Palestine say the British are weak. It's time for us to push the British out. And the fight begins over control of what becomes Medinat Israel. And then the story turns very significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is, I've done a number of talks about this already, you know. My favorite soundbite is, we all know in real history that in 1947, the King David Hotel was bombed by the Irgun. Because the Irgun told them they were going to do it. They didn't move it, they were killed. Well, in my book, not only are British officers murdered, but American peacekeepers are killed as well. Now, how American peacekeepers actually get there, you have to read the book, but be that as it may. At that point in time, a little-known senator from Missouri named Harry S. Truman gets up and says, if there were a strong existential crisis facing the Jewish people, I could continue to support the Zionists, but they've killed Americans. The Daily Mirror, of somewhat blessed memory, some of us may remember the Daily Mirror, has a banner headline that says, Palestinian Jews attack America. And the question I ask in this book and beyond the book, what I want people to think about is, what is the reaction of the American Jewish community to a government and a population that has turned virulently anti-Zionist? And to make things worse, when America starts turning away from Zionism, David Ben-Gurion starts developing a relationship with Joseph Stalin. We, Jews, Israelis, we need arms to fight against the Arabs. How does that play on the American street? How does that play on the Jewish street? And the way I tell the story, which is a somewhat revisionist history of Zionism, is that American Jews run for cover.
In your book.
In my book. And here's what I want to say in terms of contemporary world. Whatever you think of the difficulties Jews face today with the present administration, the reality is American Jews have, and listen to my words carefully, American Jews have never faced a president of the United States who is explicitly opposed to Zionism in Israel. The closest we came to this was in 1956, during the Suez Canal crisis, when the British Friends and Israelis were forced to leave because of John Foster Dulles and Dwight David Eisenhower. But in my book, we have an explicit set of presidents. First, Robert Taft, who starts out as a Zionist because he had a close personal connection, real history again, with Abba Hillel Silver, very leading Reform Zionist rabbi, and but then turns because of the bombing of the King David Hotel. And then 1948, George Marshall, who was the point man in staring down the Soviets in 1944, becomes president of the United States, and he is anti-Zionist, and he says there are 50 billion gallons of oil. Why are we supporting the Israelis and support the Arabs? It's a very difficult time for American Jews, and American Jews run for cover, which creates an extraordinary rift between Palestinian Jews, Israelis I mean, and Americans. Real history, ladies and gentlemen. 1949, David Ben-Gurion makes a statement which he later walked back and when he said that there's no future for American Jewry, and we'll take your children and we'll make them real Jews. When he's confronted by this, he walks it back and says, I really didn't mean that, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in my book, he sticks by it. And Joseph Proskauer, the head of the American Jewish Committee, a virulent anti-Zionist, he's very disturbed. It speaks to the question of Jewish attitudes toward Zionism and our sense of belonging and power. And I want to say one other thing. I know I'm rambling on.
Perfect.
I'm doing okay? Fine.
Perfect.
Okay, good.
Yes.
That's fine. Enough. When we think about our own history, about our activism, post-Holocaust, Soviet Jewry movement, etc., one of the things that we have going for us constantly is that we can see that what we want to do is, for the most part, has the approval at least of the American people, if not the American government. Here we have a situation where Jews feel much like they felt in the 1930s, isolated, unempowered, if that's a word, and skittish about their relationship with other Americans. So it is counterfactual history. It didn't happen, but I want people to think about realities of today and over the course of time through this book.
Excellent. And we're going to get there in one moment.
And hold the applause to the bitter end. Okay, thank you.
No, keep applauding.
Okay, fine.
I want you to speak about one other dimension, and then I do want to talk about what's the point of this. It's not simply a nice counterfactual story. You wrote this with a point in mind. But I want you to spend a moment now talking about how you portray American Jewish life when there was no World War II, when there were no American Jewish veterans coming back from serving in the war, when the American administration is not nearly as pro-Israel as the reality was, when not only Ben-Gurion in your book, but you quote a real line from Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister during the Six-Day War, and your book goes up to the Six-Day War. At one point, I want to know why you chose, I understand why you chose 38 to begin. I'm curious why you chose 67 to end. But you have Eshkol also being very critical of American Jewry. And one of the things you say throughout the book, you're very honest in being honest with us, the reader, is how, one of the words you use is dark. You are in some way critical of the American Jewish community that you create. It does not have the kind of, there isn't the Avi Weiss mentality in the American Jewish community that you describe. If I'm wrong, you'll explain.
No, but
my sense was that you say over and over in the book, American Jewry almost didn't come of age because the historical circumstances were so different. They never became as Zionist as pieces of American Jewry did become. American Jewry is not universally Zionistic to this day. But in your book, you're critical of the extent to which so much of American Jewry is not Zionist. It'd be interesting for you to talk about, would there have been an AIPAC that would have developed on the American Jewish scene in your counter-history? So before we talk about what are the consequences for us today, I do want you to describe how you imagine the American Jewish community to have evolved given the lack of the Shoah and the extent to which we were not involved in either the Pacific or the European theater. And we will get to how Soviet Jewry is portrayed in your book. But talk for a moment about what seems to be a criticism you have for the American Jewish community described in your book.
So several things come to mind. First of all, in real history, the 1930s is a very difficult time for American Jews. It's the apogee of social anti-Semitism, tremendous amount of discrimination. Jews do not feel at home in America, and I described that. Yeah. So that's going to continue long after the 1940s. Second piece, and I want to say this carefully, World War II is a horrible, calamitous time for the Jewish people. However, for the Jews of America, it turns out to be a very good time, and let me explain. Because of the fact that 2 million Jewish boys and several thousand Jewish girls fight in the American army and are accepted as equals. It is a moment where Jews gain a certain degree of acceptance by virtue of the fact that, let me put it this way. The State Department in the 1940s, Yamach Shemam, their name should be blotted out, often said, this is the war effort. Cooperate with us, work with us. And that was one of the ways they put off Jewish protest. Well, in my book, the fact is we did cooperate as American citizens, as veterans, etc. I would suggest to you that for most Americans, one of the most iconic moments in World War II that's often portrayed is when they raised that flag in Iwo Jima. If you know the story, they did it twice, once for the cameras and once real, okay? Well, there's a second image that is very powerful in America that hasn't been given enough credit, and that is the sinking of the Dorchester. Can I see by a show of hands how many people have heard of the sinking of the Dorchester? A handful of hands have just gone up. This is a story of a boat, of a ship, an American ship that's torpedoed, I think it's in North Atlantic. And there are 4 chaplains aboard, a rabbi, Alexander Goody, a Catholic priest, and 2 Protestant ministers. The ship is going down. I'm chagrined and humiliated. I don't remember the names of the priests and the ministers, but be that as it may, they give their life preservers to sailors, and they go down with the ship. They go down with the ship reciting psalms, which we as Jews and Christians have in common. What an iconic image of Jews, 2% of the population, right? 3%. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. This was a very powerful image that existed during that time period. So we come out of that war not only angry about what happened to our people, but also get a sense of we belong within the United States. And truth be told, although anti-Semitism does not decline immediately after World War II, having a lot to do with the Shoah and many other aspects of American history, the doors begin to open for American Jews and things become much, much better. But you also asked me about Zionism. So I want to give a quick course on Zionism. If you want more on Zionism, study with me at the Bernard Revel Graduate School, okay? A little plug for them. Zionism in America has fits and starts. Up until World War I, around World War I, due to the involvement of Louis Brandeis, there's an efflorescence of Zionism. And the Balfour Declaration is declared, and American Jews go to sleep. From 1933 to 38, there is a rise in feeling on behalf of Zionism because of the crisis taking place in Germany and Austria, Czechoslovakia, and later Eastern Europe. In 1942, you're a Reformed rabbi. Your movement finally adopts a platform supporting Zionism. But you know, the vote is a very close vote. There's plenty of anti-Zionism or non-Zionism. Non-Zionism means that the needs of our community, namely the old age homes and the schools and the other philanthropic organizations, take precedence over overseas aid. That's real history. Well, in my book, all I have to do is change 5 votes, and I have the reform movement staying anti-Zionist. Okay? Within the Orthodox group, I have a wonderful, tragic scene that I took from a sermon which Rabbi Haskell Luckstein gave at Kehillat Jeshurun. He's the principal of Ramaz, which is my alma mater, my wife's alma mater, my children's alma mater, where Haskell Luckstein talks about his father, Joseph Luckstein, trying to get Jews to cooperate to speak out against Nazism. And he's unable to convince a variety of Orthodox groups to appear with him in his synagogue, because the Reformed rabbi, Abba Hillel Silver, is also there. So I use that real moment in time to tell the story of great disunity among American Jews. So what I'm trying to suggest is that in many instances, the vitality of our response to things has a lot to do with how we feel about America. And I want to say something else about World War II. One of the iconic images is Rosie the Riveter. okay? In my book, it's Susie the homemaker, okay? American women, Jewish and Gentile, don't go into the factories. The beginnings of the women's movement, the contemporary women's movement can be dated from this. I have Susie the homemaker, stay at home. So again, you take the historical story and you twist it because I'm talking about an American Jewry that should not be so proud of itself. A lot of the vitality of what we do has to do with how we feel about being in America. And one last thing, I feel like Ronald Reagan, I have the mic, you know. Jewish support for civil rights is also a piece of the story. Now, every African American in the world would say that the civil rights movement started very slowly and developed very slowly and has never reached its completion in some respects. But in the 1940s, in the late 40s, early 50s, in real history, Harry S. Truman signs a number of laws, fair employment practices, housing, etc., which my George Marshall, who I know from real history is a racist, he works with the Dixiecrats to make sure those laws aren't passed. And what do American Jews do in terms of vitality of their activity on behalf of African Americans? Well, Andrew Schwerner appears in my book. Andrew Schwerner, along with Goodman and Cheney, are killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi. When he's a student at Cornell University in the 1960s, he's unable to get his fraternity to admit an African American. So, one other device in the book which should be mentioned, and my son Ellie suggested it was a great suggestion, and that is each chapter ends with a synopsis of what really happened. So you can compare what really happened with what I'm describing in the book.
I want to push you one more moment.
Sure.
I want to ask the same question I did a moment ago in a slightly different way. What I feel you're saying in the book is some of the word flaw may be unfair, but I feel some of the weaknesses that are existing now in American Jewish life, which you have addressed in other contexts, are flaws which in your book simply happen sooner. That in some of the ways in which Jewish life does not develop a strong sense of pride, Jewish identity, you deal with the question of, are you a Jew or an American? To the extent to which, are you a Jew first? Are you being disloyal to America if you take a certain kind of Zionist stand? Some of the things you seem to say in the book, I say to myself, amazingly, the things Jeff is pointing out that happened in his book maybe 20 years earlier are happening now. And the only difference is that because of the way in which you've drawn the historical line, they happen earlier. And I'm wondering, A, do you think I'm seeing it accurately? And is that part of your message? And here we now come to, why do you do a book like this? It's not simply because you want to be a novelist. You're hoping that your book will make us ask certain questions about ourselves. And the questions all have to do with, how strong is Jewish self-identity? How strong is Jewish pride? To what extent are we committed to the state of Israel, whether we are planning on living in America for the rest of our lives or not? To what extent are we Jewish Americans, where American is the noun, or are we American Jews, where the Jew is the noun? And your book raises these questions in a fabulous way. And so I'm saying to you, I want to know now where you see Jewish life today and contrast it to the Jewish life that you describe in your book. And after Jeff deals with this question, if any of you have a question, we have a microphone set up, and we will invite any of you to come one by one and ask Jeff any question. You may also disagree with any aspect of his counterfactual history. But I want you to take a moment and talk about where you feel Jewish life is today, and is it simply, did it simply evolve in the same way it just would have happened sooner had there been no World War II and no Shoah?
So I wish to say two things in this regard. First of all, on the question of dual loyalty Okay? As I mentioned earlier on, the challenge that's confronted us, is more historically more in the Jewish soul than the outside world imposing it upon us. And I just wonder how strongly we would stand up if, in the event, God forbid, that things turn even more dramatically against Israel than we see today.
I'm sorry, you're worried about how American Jewry today would stand up if
in fact the question of, where our loyalties actually stand. We've never been challenged like this until the present day. But there's one other piece to the book which we could talk about for an hour, but I want to very quickly mention it, and that is, one of the challenges of the book is to say, well, in real history, things worked out quite well for Jews in terms of their acceptance. They got into colleges, universities, Ivy League schools, Jewish studies, all those types of things. And yet, we have a crisis of Jews, forget about their attitude towards Israel, falling away from their Jewishness. And I
an enormous problem of assimilation.
And I end the book with that.
That's
and I
right.
say that in my counterfactual history, the pressure to give up one's Jewishness was far greater than in the realities today, and that the issue for American Jews in a cultural pluralistic America, do we want to affirm our Jewishness in a world that is accepting of us, at least in America? So there's a whole section on Jewish life on campus, okay, where the Hillels can't get anyone to come to Shabbat services and things of that sort, because the Jews want to fit in. There's a section on Brandeis University. Poor Abraham Sacker can't build a school because Jews want to go to other schools. So there are all different aspects of the suburban experience and the assimilation experience, which is another part of the book, which we really haven't focused on much today. But I'd love to hear if there are any comments from my friends.
By the way, where is our microphone set up? It is where? Okay. If there is anybody who would like to ask Jeff a question, just come down, walk across, and go to the microphone. And I am full of questions, so no one should feel obligated to do so. But here's your chance to ask Jeff Gurock any question. And you're not going to hear from me what you always hear. Don't make a statement. You want to make a statement, make a statement. Make it quick, and then ask Jeff to answer your question. Do me a favor, identify yourself.
My name is Oren Rahat. I'm a student at Revel, Professor Gurock. So you're saying...
And he's desirous of getting his degree, so ask your question.
You posit that a great part of Jewish acceptance within the general society has to do with service in World War II as soldiers. If there is no World War II, there's another population that you briefly touched that also does not get that chance for acceptance, namely African Americans. Do you touch more about their lack of acceptance in Jewish society in your book, or this is kind of in the very background?
In terms of African American Jewish relationships?
No, just as African American, if I would say that there is some parallel between the acceptance of Jews and African Americans in that, if under that posit.
Okay, so Jewish advocacy for African Americans, and at least until the late 60s, and the book ends with 1967, okay, has a lot to do with the sense that this is something that thoughtful Americans are in favor of, and you could support African Americans without being seen as counter to the flow of American society. Probably very few people know that the Holy New York Times, until the 1940s, orthography-wise, when they mentioned blacks, it was always lowercase b and whites uppercase W. Just to give you a sense of where things were at this point. What I'm trying to say here is that the African American experience has been far more difficult than the Jewish experience, but both suffer from an America which is more racist and more discriminatory than the reality happens to be. George Marshall, I picked George Marshall as a president because it represents the fact that this is where America is at, a continuation of Jim Crow, a continuation of the social anti-Semitism of the prior period.
By the way, we know first of all, it isn't perfect yet, but it certainly took a civil rights movement in the 60s to make significant change. However, it was during World War II, under Harry Truman, that the military was desegregated.
After World War II, right after World War II.
It wasn't during World War
Right
II?
after World War II.
Where under Truman,
Right.
there were African Americans who became part of the military.
Right, right. And of course, as we both know, one
Yes.
of our heroes,
Jackie Robinson.
1947,
Right.
people say the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement can be dated from the time that he's allowed to play Americans.
And there's no question that, again, in real history, the contributions Jews made to the Civil Rights Movement, which at the moment seems to be getting very short shrift in the historical documentation,
Correct.
whether it's in film or book. But the reality is that the Jewish community was instrumental in moving the Civil Rights Movement forward.
At least during this time period that ends with 1967.
Yeah. Another question, please. Identify yourself and ask your question.
Nissan Hershkowitz, Brooklyn, New York. Thank you. My question is, does your book consider the absence of the survivors and their children from the American scene? These were people who did not leave Europe because they had possessions, they had opportunities that those of you whose ancestors came here precisely for that reason. And they only were forced to leave because of Hitler, and they came with a wealth of Jewish culture and identity, and they were able, I think, and that's my question, in your consideration, their self-consciousness and proudness of Jewish identity based on knowledge permeated Jewish life and the activist movements, for example. Does your book consider how those would have developed in their absence?
Very much so, and I sort of anticipate this question, particularly since this is a meeting which is involved with Yeshiva University. Okay, survivors and refugees were not all Orthodox; they came from a variety of backgrounds. But one of the things I consider in the book is the nature of religious life, denominational life, absent of those people who come before, during, and after the war. I want to say this properly. And that is, many of these Jews are the people who either explicitly or implicitly hearkened to the words of the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Israel Meir HaKohen Kagan, who said, "Don't come to America. America is a treif land. Even the stones are impure." And they come to America. After the war, having not surrendered to some extent a sense of cultural superiority that my ancestors, Gurocks, have been here over 110 years. I just found out that my grandfather, I always said my grandfather came here in 03 because of pogrom in Gomel. Turns out he came in 05, so I have to revise that personal history. But be that as it may, these people who come after World War II, or during World War II, come with a greater sense of Jewishness and their sense of, I'm a Jewish American, and give a great vitality to traditional Judaism. I'll just give you a number. As of 1940, there are approximately 8,000 students who are students in yeshivot throughout the United States. Call me a liar by 100%. I don't care. Make it 16,000. That's a drop in the bucket, and almost all of them are living in Brooklyn Orthodoxy. In my real historical mode, I've written about the Orthodox community in Brooklyn during the interwar period, the Torah Vodaas crowd, the Chaim Berlin crowd, etc. Their presence is strengthened tremendously by those people who come because the Europe they know is destroyed before their eyes, or is in the process of being destroyed, and they bring that sense of power and cultural superiority. And I have to say one other thing, which is real history, and that is the ability from Jews to maintain their fidelity to their faith certainly is a function of their commitment, but they're also living in an America, and I keep getting back to this in my classes and my writing, to America which looks at Jews who are different as exotic rather than as strange. So it's what you want to do, it's also what America wants to do. A few years ago, I was in a conference on Mennonites and Jews at the University of Maryland. Mennonites are like the Amish. And there was a guy on the panel, I had a beard back then, who was dressed just like me, except I had my head covered. And he made a comment after I gave my paper that he had recently been in Borough Park, and he was so surprised to see how many Amish were in Borough Park. Okay? My point here is that your ability to maintain your faith commitments has a lot to do with what you believe in, but also what America makes possible for you to do.
And that's in real life.
And that's real life.
Yes.
In my story, there is a decline in that Torah
Yes.
community, and those who are really from, what are they doing? They're looking back to Eastern Europe. The Gedolei HaTorah are still in Eastern Europe, and they want to go back. They don't make that commitment to America. Great question. Thank you.
By the way, in real life, we understand there are now two great centers of Jewish community, Israel and America. And European Jewry is under assault, but under any circumstance, the two great lights are Israel and America. In your counterfactual history, is America overshadowed by, I'm now using European in a broad sense, European Jewry? Because the reality is, Jeff, even before World War I, Jews are leaving Europe in great numbers. There is both anti-Semitism that Theodor Herzl witnesses in the Dreyfus trial and says that Jews will never be real citizens in Western Europe. And in Eastern Europe, there are pogroms and there are blood libels and there are things that are making it. My grandparents flee from that Russia and come to America before World War I, not even World War II. So one of the things I wondered was, do you imagine that in your history, American Jewry is not number 2, but is number 3, and that it's Israel, Europe, and then American Jewry? Or do you still see American Jewry becoming the second center of Jewish life in the world?
Well, it's the second center by virtue of the fact that East European Jewry, though not destroyed, is under cultural deprivation. But one of the things I'm emphasizing is that 100 years after our ancestors came here, and that's how I began this discussion, there is a cultural and personal disconnect between Jews of America and their ancestors in Eastern Europe. I quote a conservative rabbi in some suburban town saying that I can't get them to give any money on behalf of the poor Jews of Eastern Europe, even though their relatives were there. So there is this degree of disconnect that I think is very powerful, and a degree of disconnect between the Jews of Palestine and Israel and American Jews.
A major theme of your book. Please identify yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Merrill Davis, and I live right here on Manhattan on the East Side.
Thank you, Merrill.
First, I'd like to make a statement. In your book, my father would not have served 5.5 years in the service and never would have liberated Buchenwald. My question is, in your book, what happens to mandated Palestine, mandated British Palestine? You don't mention that.
Okay.
Well, you did a little bit.
I touched on it. So the mandate over Palestine is far more benign after 1938 than in real history.
Right.
In 1946 to 48, the British are pushed out by the Arabs and by the Jews. And thank God, in my book, the Jews of Palestine succeed against the odds. I use in that respect some of the Israeli historiography about the relative power of Arab forces as opposed to Jewish forces, but I also bring in the activities of the Czechoslovakians and the Soviets in arming the Palestinian Jews, and just think about how America would view American Palestinian Jews who are seemingly cozying up to the hated Soviets. One of the themes in the book is the degree of anti-communism in this country. And real history, we know from real history that after World War II, the anti-communism in this country, whether it's the Rosenbergs or other types of situations, the American Jewish community divorces itself extricates itself from its left-wing groups. There are stories told, it's actually in my Gotham book, that during the McCarthy era, there were co-ops in Pelham Parkway, which have Art Deco of Soviet leaders, and people were coming to the library at night and dropping off their communist literature because they're afraid someone's going to invade their home. Okay, it never happened. This is the paranoia. What I'm saying here is that just imagine how Americans would feel towards Jews if we were seen as cooperating with Stalin. Now, the other piece of the story is Stalin, at the end of the day, real history and counterfactual history was anti-Semitic. Okay, but to embarrass the British and to embarrass the Americans, and feeling that the Zionists, by virtue of their socialist orientation, might be more amenable towards the Soviet bloc, arms find their way to Palestine, which helped the Irgun Haganah, but don't help American Jews as they look at their Palestinian brethren.
I want to get a couple questions in real quick, and then I have my last question. Please, your name and question, and I want a quick answer.
Ellen Mendel, and I'm from the Upper West Side of
Ellen,
Manhattan.
you write me all the time.
I write you all the
It is
time.
thrilling to meet you. Go ahead.
It's thrilling for me to meet you.
Thank you, darling.
And I wouldn't be standing here in your book. But my question has to do with the cultural aspects that were developed and enriched in Hollywood, in terms of the films, in terms of drama, in terms of music, in terms of art history, in terms of so many areas where often, unfortunately, and this goes back to what the other person before asked and you answered, they didn't reveal themselves as Jews very often because of the context of the times. However, they were like pioneers in terms of some of their innovations in all those areas. And not only that, what about the scientists who came here? And then the development of the atom bomb, et cetera. So all of these people who wouldn't have come, I imagine, in your book, or are they in your book, and how do you develop that?
Okay, so many of these people don't come here, although many of the scientists are here before the Great War. But one quick point about Hollywood, okay? I have a segment in the book about the movie Gentleman's Agreement. Mm-hmm. So Gentleman's Agreement was a very important movie that exposes the phenomena of social anti-Semitism in the United States. Now, in my book, guess what happens? They're unable to get anyone to finance the movie because they don't want to embarrass the anti-Semites. So that's everything is twisted.
Thank you for. I'm
I have a very
glad
twisted
to meet
mind,
you,
yeah.
Ellen. One more question, and then we'll begin to wrap up. Your name, please.
My name is Dennis Math. It's great to see the two of you in this context.
Dennis, by the way, is a dear, dear friend who goes back with Jeff and with myself forever, and he is one of the truly blessed people of this world. What's your question?
You may not like the question, and in all due respect, I can't wait to read the book, and I appreciate the fact that the reality of the situation is after every chapter. But is there a small, small chance that Holocaust deniers may use this book, cut and paste it to flame their fire, and misuse the fiction in this book for their own purposes?
Super. I want to piggyback on Dennis's question.
That's a great question.
I want to piggyback on it. And I have been struggling how to ask this question in the respectful way, and it's because of our history that I can ask it the way I'm going to ask it. There is a sacredness to the Shoah. It's almost as if certain imaginations are impermissible. It would have been so wonderful if there was no Shoah, but there was. And so I want you to speak to Dennis's question, and also I want to hear if you grappled at all with whether, on the one hand, this is such a fascinating ability to look at how Jewish history did work and to ask questions about who we are, but to do it, the person who did not liberate Buchenwald, but all the people who died at Buchenwald never died, but they did. And in some way, is it, I don't know, Jewishly sacrilegious to even create a story in which the Shoah did not occur? So I ask it myself with a certain kind of profound respect for what you've done here. But I do want to hear you address both Dennis's question and this larger issue, which I know you're sensitive to.
Well, as far as revisionist historiography about American Jewish life, they don't need my fiction to twist what we stand for. Real history, like history of Jewish involvement in slave activity, we're a minuscule part of this, has been twisted and turned, etc. So frankly, I can't be concerned with what haters of Jews do with my stuff, because they do the same thing with real history. So I'm concerned, but I'm confident that the book will be viewed on its own merits, and those who hate us, that's their problem. As far as reverence for the Holocaust is concerned, look, that section of the book, and I said this in my discussion with you, that says World War II is a good time for American Jews. I say with a certain degree of pain, a certain degree of pain. In my Jews of Gotham, I have a story about a friendship circle that goes away on a weekend vacation to the Catskills in 1942. And in the book, I talk about the menu, what Jews of America are eating at Grossinger's in 1942, okay? And that document was derived from a family archive. My mother saved this menu, and she writes in her own handwriting, "Can you believe we're eating like this during wartime?" And my dear wife pointed out to me the first time I mentioned this, that I should mention the fact that while this is happening, her father is in a labor camp at Auschwitz. So I don't take a backseat to anyone in terms of my reverence for those, okay?
Absolutely.
But at the end of the day, I'm a historian, and I want to teach. And I want to teach certain realities which transcend this experience.
Okay.
And that's why I wrote the book.
Okay, good for you. So, to conclude, many times we've been sitting together on L'chaim or elsewhere, and you'll say to me, I'll ask a question about where is Jewish life going, and you're saying, that's not my job. My job is not to prognosticate. But you've acknowledged this book opens you up to being asked certain kinds of questions. And now I'm just asking Jeff Gurock, a committed, passionate Jew, observer of Jewish life. I want you to take two minutes or so. Drawing upon your book, or just drawing upon where you see Jewish life today, you have an audience here of deeply, passionately committed Jews who care about the future of where Jewish life is going. Jeff Gurock, where do you see Jewish life going now? What about Jewish life troubles you? What about Jewish life gives you a sense of hope?
So when in doubt, as historian, you always quote Baron, okay? Sailor Baron, the greatest Jewish historian of the 20th century, who made a bit of an error in 1937. One of his many books was called Steeled by Adversity, S-T-E-E-L-E-D, Steeled by Adversity. And when asked by his students, why did you call the American Jewish experience steeled? What is the adversity? And he said, it's the adversity of freedom. How can we live as a robust, continuing community in a country which, thank God, is very accepting of us, more accepting than ever before? In my book, things are even worse. But the challenge for us as American Jews is to see how we can live productively in concert with Medinat Yisrael as committed Jews and survive in a world in a country which, at least to this point, has been uncommonly accepting of us.
Are you optimistic about the Jewish future?
I'm optimistic that there'll be a hardcore of people who will maintain their Jewishness.
But only a hardcore.
But the challenge is to enlighten and engage so many other people. And that's one of the things that Jewish Broadcasting Service does around the country. So thank you very much.
Is he amazing? 40 years. 40 years. This is what Jeff Gurock has been giving us. It is an honor always to sit with you. Thank you. Thank you. Stay where you are. Stay where you are. I got to sign off. You're still part of the show. Sit down for one more moment. Dr. Jeffrey S. Gurock, author of The Holocaust Averted, an Alternative History of American Jewry from 1938 to 1967. He's going to be signing this book out in the lobby. It should be part of your home library. Of course, as always, I invite all you watching throughout America on JBS to share any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas and observations offered by Jeff Gurock tonight. So please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. My thanks to all those who made tonight's live JBS evening from the Center for Jewish History possible, especially to the Center's president and CEO, Jay Levy, and to the director of the Yeshiva University Museum, Jacob Weiss, who did, again, a masterful job arranging tonight's program. And for those of you who are here tonight, remember there'll be dessert, a reception organized by Rutgers University Press, the publishers of The Holocaust Averted, when you'll also be able to get a signed copy of the book, and you'll have a chance to, again, purchase the autographed book. The Holocaust Averted. For JBS, my thanks to our brilliant director up in the boondocks there, Sloan Copeland, fabulous job, and our fabulous production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, down here. Thanks also, that's sweet of you. Thanks also to JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, to our camera crew tonight, Oleg Oswolenko, Igor Funk, Alex Arbit, Ilya Arbit. For those in the JBS Master Control back at home, Mark Baker and Corey Sivikov, to JBS's Senior Vice President, Eli Kohanim, and to our producer for tonight's live telecast, Carol Lilienthal, and of course to Ron Jacobson for the work he did at the beginning of this show. My thanks also to all of you who shared this evening with us live here at the Center for Jewish History, and to those of you who watched throughout America on JBS television. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.